joining me for a discussion today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to be here, and I was really glad and really appreciative that you hit me back on Twitter and took the time to read the little piece I wrote, and just really excited to talk to you.
Yeah, me too, man. I just read the updated version that you had on your Substack, and I guess we can dive right into that. And of course, we can take the conversation anywhere you'd like to. But this theme of veterans becoming interested in Bitcoin and becoming ideologically almost a very congruent thing with the experiences of veterans and the ideology or philosophy behind, being a soldier and many of the things that you have to learn and integrate as a soldier, and then coming out of that and perhaps seeing what the machine looks like and maybe having a different view of it, and then encountering Bitcoin and seeing both a potential solution to some of the problems you may have seen within that system, but also some very similar attributes that carry over very well. So, basically the floor is yours. You just, tell me what you've been thinking around this thing. And of course, your experiences as a veteran would be interesting to hear as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start out by saying, like, there's kind of this joke in the veteran community. Like, anytime you say as a veteran, ... like, you're kind of going to get made fun of. I'm going to break that rule and say as a veteran. I started thinking about Bitcoin from the angle as a veteran.
Why do you get made fun of?
Well,
like, why is it a no-no?
It's just like, people will be like, oh, as a veteran, my opinion on, the Second Amendment is sacrosanct, or as a veteran, my opinion on.
It's like a quasi appeal to authority sort of thing. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, kind of. And just like, a little bit of like chest thumping, I guess. But so I'm going to break that rule and say, as a veteran, I was looking at Bitcoin kind of through that angle. And one of the reasons I wanted to kind of write the short piece I wrote is I've always been looking at what I can do to kind of help the veteran community. There's a lot of different groups and organizations and charities out there, and it's actually almost overwhelming. And then since I've kind of dove down the Bitcoin rabbit hole a couple of years ago, I've had the same sort of thing with Bitcoin in terms of how can I, have a voice here? How can I influence it? What can I do to kind of move this along and help everybody out? And I kind of wanted to marry the two together. And when I was thinking a lot about it, it's this weird kind of dichotomy where at a strategic level, right? All the people who are really into Bitcoin know about the petrodollar system and about the fiat system and about how, what's the dollar backed by? Well, really, it's backed by the US military and the US Navy and shipping lanes and all that. And so counterintuitively, like, you'd think, okay, well, Bitcoin kind of wants to smash all that, right? Or at least alter that or change that. But at an individual level, I think there's actually a lot of overlap between like individual veterans and like individual Bitcoiners, or kind of the goals of Bitcoin. And it's hard to make, if you're going to speak broadly, you kind of have to make broad statements. So I would caveat it with, like, the veteran community is a pretty big community. There's all sorts of subgroups. There's all different aspects of it, just like in Bitcoin, same thing. But to kind of make some broad or paint things with a little bit of a broad brush, I think there's a lot of idealism at the root of both, right? Why do people join? And I'll kind of focus on the US military just because that's my experience, but I think it's pretty applicable globally. Why do you join the military, assuming you're not conscripted? Well, there's some idealism behind it, and you're not thinking, I'm going to go up and I'm going to take that oath because I want to secure shipping lanes and support the petrodollar system, right? Like, that's not why you're doing it. That's not why, an 18-year-old is going to take that leap, or a 22-year-old officer is going to take that leap. You're doing it because you want to make a difference. You want to serve your country, and you want to be some small part of trying to make a better world, right? And, you get higher up in ranks and you get into the strategic aspect of things and you get into the politics. But at the younger age and at the lower levels, you're not really doing it for any of those kind of larger goals. So, and I think obviously in Bitcoin, the parallel is, I think most Bitcoiners get into it with a sense of idealism and a sense of hope and a sense of wanting to make the world a better place and leaving a mark and, being part of something bigger than themselves. So I think, on the positive side, there's a lot of kind of, I would say, idealism and hope overlap in those two communities, or at least as the impetus for sort of why you get involved in them, why you dedicate your time and your life and their energy to both those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and well, there's a lot to go on there, but so for one, how much do you? Because I read that in your article, that people get involved in the military for at least partially for idealistic reasons, and I'm sure we all see like the the Marine TV commercials, right? And that just, I mean, at least for me, I can only speak for myself, but I see that shit and I'm like, fuck yeah, like that. I want to be a part of that. I mean, it's so, there's so much glory and there's so much honor, and it just seems like there's so many elements there that really appeal to, I think, maybe the better, the more honorable aspects of ourselves. But, if you are informed about these things, or, certainly if you have certain political ideologies or philosophies, well, that that's a type of propaganda to get you into a machine to basically carry out the agenda or the objectives of the government behind it. And sometimes they may be noble, or certain elements of it may be noble, but I think we would all probably agree that it's gotten way out of control. Like defending your country, your homeland is one thing. Going out on all these different geopolitical missions for all these different interests that have co-opted that apparatus is certainly another thing. And so you maybe get involved for idealistic reasons, but I'm wondering, does that idealism change the longer you're in it? Do you become more disillusioned? Do you become, do you eject from that sort of ideology, and then it becomes something else entirely, and maybe you even begin to resent it? And the reason why I'm kind of taking that line of thinking is because when you compared the two to Bitcoin, and I would say, to be fair, like a lot of people do come to Bitcoin for like, the idealism, like a state-free money, but also, of course, they come for number go up, right? And then they end up being like, oh, wow, this is way more than just me being able to increase my wealth. And then they stay and they become transformed and they become involved for other reasons. But I think the reason why it has such a sticking power is because the idealism associated with it, or the philosophy associated with them, seems so good and true in a sense. And that's where I saw the kind of divergence between the two, because I think people with your experience, or this is a question actually, do you become disillusioned even if you're initially drawn in by a certain idealism that ends up evaporating the longer you're there?
So yes and no. So I think you do to a certain extent, and I think it's really cliche, but one of the immediate things you realize when you're in, it doesn't matter why you joined, whatever, you're in, and then it becomes about, that guy on your left, guy on your right, your unit, your guys next to you. Certainly if you're in a position of authority, especially at the small unit level, like that platoon, that squad, that fire team that you're in charge of. And so I would almost say like the idealism stays in that respect, right? So at this, and you almost like it, like you mentioned before, it actually almost, you're trying to get to the better version of yourself. And there's certain things that will kind of only come out under that level of duress and that level of testing and stress, especially from like, not just, hey, I'm in a firefight, but also the idea of just the responsibility thrown on you for other people and their well-being at a young age at kind of all levels. And so you kind of go back to like, whatever war you're fighting in, I think in whatever country, in whatever time period in history, there's almost, and that's why they kind of look at this like universal throughout time and space, kind of like warrior brotherhood, because I think everybody who's ever been part of any sort of combat becomes disillusioned pretty quickly with like the strategic level stuff, right? But they, I think, do not become disillusioned and maybe even more hardened in their resolve once they realize, or once they focus on that small level stuff and really the people directly around them. So it's kind of it's sort of a split answer. And I would also say, I mean, I'm more disillusioned now, and I don't want to paint myself as like Tom Cruise on the 4th of July. I'm not that. I'm very proud of it. I do think there's some cool stuff we still do with the military, but I'm more disillusioned now than I was before I kind of dug into Bitcoin, mostly because I now have a better understanding of kind of geopolitical machinations and how the military kind of is involved in that, and to what extent kind of the conflicts we go into are driven by economic concerns versus some of the idealistic concerns or ideological concerns that we were sold on.
Mhm.
Right. So I think, in kind of oddly understanding Bitcoin better has made me slightly more disillusioned with the military just at that high level. And I think, but again, there's this paradox, like I would never change what I did. I would never change my decision to join. I would never change the experiences. And I'll get into kind of some of what those were, but I would also never do it again. And I would not send my kids to the military today. Right. And so that's a really weird, I consider myself a fairly thoughtful person. I think a lot of veterans are, and it's a very weird kind of like emotional state to be in, where you feel a little bit torn because you're very proud of what you did, but you're very frustrated to a certain extent with how you were treated, right, by kind of the powers that be. So it's a tough question to answer. It's kind of yes and kind of no at the same time.
Yeah, no, I can appreciate that. And I can also appreciate, the point you made about, because once you make a decision, it's made, right? There's not much point in lamenting that you've decided to be a part of this. And so I think that's why, what's the point of questioning, almost in a sense, the morality of the mission or the strategy? Then it makes total sense to focus on what you can control, right? You can control your ability to adapt to the situation or conform yourself or forge yourself into someone who's most capable of adapting to that situation, forming those bonds with the people that you're there with, bonds of trust, bonds of friendship, looking out for them as they look out for you. And all that is very, again, like back to the Marine commercial, all that, there's something like primal about that I think speaks to a lot of us. And that's part of the reason perhaps why someone who's gone through it would say what you just said, which is like, I'm kind of torn, right? It's kind of paradoxical. I wouldn't do it again, but I wouldn't have not done it. Like I wouldn't go back and undo it, And so there's a tension there between, there's a tension there, but I can certainly appreciate it, And as you're talking about it, this is not a perfect parallel, but it makes me think of, like, you could pick any martial arts, Jim, really, but I'm thinking of like the times of Plato, right? Where Plato was this big jacked wrestler, and you can imagine like these guys get together and they're like wrestling and sweating it out on a daily basis and really working hard. And then, and they're building these bonds of mutual self-respect, because when you see how someone else works, especially under pressure, and like what you described, and I'm sure what you went through is one of the most intense crucibles you can imagine. It's like, there's probably, as far as I understand, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no real room for error. And if one of your, one of your brothers sees that you're slacking, making mistakes, cutting corners and such, they're probably going to call you out, because, it's a very consequential thing to do that. And if everyone is engaging in that in a constructive way, then you're probably going to come out the backside in a, carved into, molded into a better version of yourself, as you said. And I think that was the case, back then as well. And that's why, physical fitness and exercise and combat and stressful situations were part and parcel with extracting the best of yourself, which of course led into your thinking and your philosophy as well. I mean, they're obviously they influence each other. But yeah, I mean, you said you kind of touch on some of what your experiences were. I'd be interested in hearing that, if for no other reason, for context.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I'll kind of start at the beginning. So I grew up kind of right outside New York in the suburbs, and pretty much everyone I knew, their parents were in finance to some capacity, not all of them, but a lot of them. So I was kind of immersed in that world, went off to college, played lacrosse in college, got out and was working a little bit. And I had never really too seriously considered the military. Kind of to your point before, one of my very good friends who I ended up living with out there in California, where I was stationed, he did his commissioning ceremony for the Marine Corps in his dress blues, like in the chapel at our college. And it was pretty intense. And so that may have planted a bit of a seed, but it was not something like, hey, there's a lot of guys since I've been 6, I wanted to join, and I wasn't really like that. And so I came out, was doing work for about a year or two. And I just kept thinking, like, this is something that will test me. And I know if I don't try to do this, when I'm 50, when I'm 60, when I'm 40, I'm going to regret it. And I'm going to be really mad at myself for not trying it. There was also, obviously, like, from where I was, 9/11 was a big deal for everybody, but it was hit particularly close to home, kind of where I was. And I remember sitting in my office, standard cubicle, kind of clacking away. It's all quiet. And I hear these fluorescent lights just kind of buzzing above me. I'm, I guess, 23 or so. And I was like, I can't do this. I can't do this. Not yet, not now. And I basically took the train into Manhattan and went over to the Intrepid, the big aircraft carrier museum now on the West Side. And that was where the Marine Corps recruiting station was. And I went in, and I didn't really do a ton of homework. Like, I just was really going a lot more on gut. I did a little bit of research and stuff, but walked in and was like, hey, here I am. Do you need me? And they were like, yeah, there's a whole process and we'll do it. And so I went through that, and I did all the training, went to officer candidate school down in Quantico, ended up being a logistics officer. So I always caveat everything I'm saying is, like, I don't want to ever leave the impression I was, like, kicking down doors and killing bin Laden. I was just a regular logistics officer in the Marine Corps. Again, did all the training. In reality, what that meant at the time, this is about 2005, 2006, was a motor transport officer. So basically a convoy commander running the really big convoys out in Iraq and Afghanistan, although I was only in Iraq. And anyway, went through the training, got my platoon, trained up, and ended up in Iraq, out in Al Asad, which is an air base out in Anbar province out west. And as I mentioned, I was running, these big logistics convoys. There's only a couple main roads you could do that on. This was like the height, this was pre-surge, kind of the height of the IED threat. And it was a mess. I mean, every time we went out, almost every time, someone was going to get hit by an IED, or the threat was obviously very high of that happening. So it was very challenging. And the short version of the story is, I was commanding a convoy one day and I got hit by an IED pretty badly. Like, it blew our Humvee sky high. It blew me out. I was down the bridge. I think I had one of the Humvee armored doors fall on my leg, which is, I have some fair number of injuries still, although I can move pretty well. But and it was bad. I kind of blacked out. I woke up, looked down, my arm was hanging on by a thread. My feet were bad. I couldn't feel anything below my waist. I remember, there's a lot of emotions, a lot of thoughts that go through at that time. And I was like, oh my God, if I die in Iraq, I swear to God. And so, there's a lot of different Marines doing different things. My radio guy's calling in. The doc, actually, the Navy corpsman, cut himself out of his seatbelt upside down, hanging over the blown up bridge, came over, helped us. I got morphine sticking out of every part of my legs, medevac back, and went from my base to a different base in Iraq, to Landstuhl, Germany, to Bethesda at the time, which was the Naval Medical Center. A lot of surgeries, a lot of recovery. Kind of had to, like, relearn how to walk and all that sort of stuff. And then recovered with, at the time, where my parents were living, and did a lot of, like, private physical therapy and a little bit through the VA. So that's a really long way of saying, like, that was kind of the obviously defining experience, or defining part of my experience in the military. And hopefully, I mean, it was rough. It was not fun. It tested me. It didn't quite test me in the way I thought it was going to be tested, right? When I signed up, I wasn't like, all right, here's the test I hope I go through. Let me get blown up by a bomb, right? It was more what you think of when you see those commercials, right? Or when you see a war movie, but different kind of test, right? And I say all that because it hopefully gives some context as to my statement before, which is, like, I still wouldn't change it. I hopefully would, like, I would, I wouldn't change anything that happened. I got very lucky, right, in a lot of respects, but I also wouldn't do it again, right? I don't want to get blown up by an IED in Iraq, because why, for maybe for a reason that I'm not entirely positive of why we're even there. And I was joking with someone the other day, I kind of I've almost come full circle in the sense of like, you remember there's all these people protesting at the time around those wars, and like the code pink people holding up signs that said no war for oil and blah, blah, blah. And I was kind of, I was pretty dismissive at the time, like, come on. And I've come to the thing where it's like, I've now understood, actually, maybe it was a war for oil and maybe they were right despite themselves, right? Maybe they actually were right without even, I would argue, without even really knowing why. So it's been a weird, a lot of, I don't think anything about my kind of worldview or kind of core principles has changed over the years. I think I've come to the realization that some of the things that I thought reflected those or maybe embodied those, maybe don't to the extent that I thought they did. But it was a very it was a very trying experience. And I struggle with, I don't want to make that the defining part of my life, but at the same time, it was a very, very big part of my life. And it's not something you can kind of just walk away from or forget. So, that's kind of a little bit of background about my experience in the military, just at the personal level.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I'd like to ask some questions. And of course, if I touch on anything that's too sensitive, you just tell me you don't want to talk about it. But so when this IED explosion happened, did you end up being removed from like war zone assignments after that because you had so much therapy and surgery and recovery to go through? And if so, how long had you been operating in a war zone at that point?
So it's funny, not very long. And yes, so I got medevaced, I did all that stuff. I spent almost a year to the day recovering to the point where I could actually go back out on my own. And I went back out to where I was assigned at Camp Pendleton out in San Diego. And I basically spent the next year kind of co-commanding with another person, another lieutenant, like a remain behind element. So all the people who didn't deploy again. And we were kind of the two officers left. And that was a challenge in its own right. A lot of like administrative challenges. There were reasons these Marines weren't deploying. So, there was some discipline stuff and things like that. Just a totally different kind of leadership challenge. And concurrently, you can imagine what it's like to out process from the military, especially after an injury, and like, there's disability payments and ratings and all that kind of stuff. So that was kind of my main personal job at the time. But it's weird. I was really only in that combat zone for like 2 months or so.
Wow.
Yeah. And they always say, like, even going back to Vietnam, I think like, don't quote me on this, but like the average lifespan of a lieutenant that got dropped into a hot zone in Vietnam was like 18 minutes, which is just insane. And so the point being, like, I think there's always a lot more risk at the beginning when you're first learning things, in country, when you're turning over with the unit before you. And I felt like I was getting in a good groove, and, this happened. So I was really only there for a couple months.
You said that when it happened and, you were lying there fucked up and the world was spinning and all that kind of stuff, that I'm sure a lot of thoughts crossed through your mind and, what the fuck am I doing here? This isn't how I wanted to go out. It's not how I imagined things, and a million other things. I mean, can you bring me that moment and what you were maybe thinking?
Yeah. So I'll start with the actual explosion. This is crazy, but I mean, it sounds cliched, but the world slows down. Like milliseconds felt like minutes, right? And I could kind of feel, I had this sensation we were in the air, and I'll never forget, kind of out of the corner of my eye, I see my driver next to me, because I was in the front passenger seat kind of commanding stuff, and with his hands on the wheel. But I had the feeling like we were in the air, and I'm like, something's off, right? But this is all processing in a matter of like microseconds. And then I remember getting tossed, like the feeling of getting tossed out and feeling kind of like I was in a washing machine and being like, no human body is meant to do this. This is going to be bad, right? But this is all like really subconscious. They're not really formed thoughts.
Right.
And then I think I was out for a very short while, kind of woke up. And aside from like obviously just terror, looking down and seeing everything broken and messed up, I was also really mad, which I'm actually kind of proud of, right? Like I did have that warrior ethos, even though I was sitting there broken on the bridge, right? I remember screaming, like, not like cry, like screaming in anger.
About what? About getting
like I can't believe this just happened to me, right? And it really pissed me off because it was like a set it and forget it IED, like a pressure plate. That dude, whoever set that, was probably at home having dinner with his family, right? There was no one I could shoot back at. There was no one I could it was really frustrating. Like it was oddly quiet. You're out in the middle of the desert, right? And so it was just like wind and quiet, and you know, you could hear some of the Marines yelling and trying to figure stuff out. But so that was, it was really interesting. And then, you know, you're kind of like, I would say my thoughts for that particular period started to get a little less lucid once the morphine started kicking in. But for a few moments sitting there, I'm like, man, I don't know if I'm going to die. And then I sort of and again, I don't know how long this was, maybe even seconds. The time kind of gets all jumbled. But I remember thinking like, okay, I don't think I'm actually going to die, but this sucks. Like I'm really hurt. And then the Navy corpsman came over, and the one sensation I really remember, they cut off we wore flight suits because they were supposedly more flame retardant. And they cut my flight suit off, and they're kind of giving me the morphine, and he had to cut my boots off, and the explosion went off right under my boots. And so there wasn't like shrapnel or anything. It was just extreme pressure from the blast. And my feet, I think, basically swelled up like loaves of bread. But he took that boot off, and I think I passed out briefly from the pain. It was the most painful thing I've ever felt. It felt like someone skinned your foot alive and lit a lighter under it. It was awful. So, you know, go through that or whatever, and we get on the medevac. And I will say I am definitely proud of the fact that I was able to keep it together enough. Kind of actually gave a few commands, told the radio guy to call it in. He was all shook up, but he was, you know, functional and walking around, but kind of shell shocked. My second in command came up. We had like a little chat before they medevaced us. And my driver actually was injured as well. So they loaded the two of us onto the medevac. But I do remember sitting there and, you know, kind of out of a movie. The Marines, they lifted me up. They put me on the litter, kind of that, you know, 4-handle stretcher thing. And I remember being very proud, right? Because they're literally running me down a bridge in 120-degree heat. I'm pretty messed up. I don't have to give them any instructions, any orders. And I remember thinking like, this is like the real recruiting commercial, right? Like these guys, no one's ever going to know they did this. And this is what it's all about. And I remember being like very proud of like, these are the guys that I at least helped train. So there's a lot going on, right? Emotionally, mentally. And then they took us back. And I do remember the last kind of really funny story is I kept asking about my balls. I was like, I cannot be 24 and have my balls.
I would be concerned about that.
And then the more drugs they gave me, like the more I kept asking, right? I'm like, oh, my balls. And they take me back to the base, and they put me in the hospital ward or whatever it is. And they're kind of all running around trying to figure it out. And anyone who walked by, I'm like, can you check my balls? It's a big concern for a 24-year-old single.
Yeah, sure.
And it's a really weird story. There's a lot else going on, but at the time, the commandant of the Marine Corps, so the officer in charge of the whole Marine Corps, and the sergeant major of the Marine Corps, so top enlisted guy in the Marine Corps, were visiting. They happened to be visiting base that day, and the sergeant major came in. I think they were like, "Hey, we just had a big hit. Come over, whatever, morale." And there's all these things going on, and he like hands me a coin, because in the military you kind of hand out coins. There's like challenge coins or whatever. And he's talking to me, and I'm like, dude, I don't want your coin right now. Like, this is a very nice gesture, but I'm like, what the hell? He's just talking to me, like having a conversation. I'm like, I'm maybe dying here, man. Like, so it was crazy. And I ended up seeing the commandant later at the time when I was in Bethesda in the hospital, and it was really cool. He came, for what it was, he came and he did my Purple Heart ceremony and pinned it on my like hospital gown and read the citation and everything. And, we were kind of chatting about stuff, and he goes, wait, you're that lieutenant? When I kind of told him what happened, and I said, yeah. And he's like, that was a ridiculously big IED blast. Like, we changed all sorts of stuff at the base after, I can't believe I can't believe you're alive, much less like you have all your limbs intact, more or less. Wow, like you're really lucky, right? I'm paraphrasing, but it was, so that was like a really small, kind of weird little coincidence. And he was nice enough. He ended up I think he got me the report of the incident, so I could kind of read some stuff and fill some gaps in that like I wouldn't have otherwise remembered. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think they said it was about a 155 artillery round and dynamite. So like, just for context, it's a 3 or 4 foot high artillery round that they had packed underneath this bridge. So it was a lot of interesting experience in that. And to be honest, I'm surprised I remembered as much as I did.
Yeah.
And certainly this was, 16, 17 years ago. Like, I'm surprised I remember as much today, but I've written some stuff down over the years so to make sure I don't forget in my old age.
Yeah. I want to ask you about what the recovery process was like, because I imagine there's a lot of time to think and ruminate and just, as you put yourself back together. But you mentioned how, your experiences reflecting back on them, you mentioned the protesters of the Iraq war and how at the time you're kind of like, shut up. And and subsequent, you're like, maybe you were right for the wrong reasons, as you put it. But I mean, how, because like so much of the real mind fuck here, maybe that's the wrong word, but there's so many good elements of this experience, but it's encapsulated in something that may be so wrong. And I'll put some meat on that bone just so you can appreciate where I'm coming from. But subsequent to the war in Iraq, right? WMDs was a big lie, right? It seems like most of the people, if not all, responsible for 9/11 had nothing to do really with Iraq. As you said, it's probably about oil and other geopolitical concerns, military industrial complex, whatever. Yeah. And so, and then on top of that, we look at what happened to Afghanistan, and I think, is probably happening or will happen to Iraq 20 years after an occupation there, leaving with your tail between your legs with nothing to show for it, basically, other than, a huge expense of both money and life on both sides. And so when you frame it like that, it's like, that is, no part of that is good, right? Nothing at all good came out of that. And a ton of sacrifice in so many different ways went into it. And so again, I'm not trying to stir up anything within you, but I'm trying to appreciate how to reconcile those things. Yeah. And, again, you had a lot of time to think about it, especially on the recovery time. So I'm just curious what you came up with.
It is tough. I think, to your point about like the Beltway Bandit contractor type, if I remember correctly, and I don't remember where I heard this, but the word was that it cost $1 million for the chow hall to run every day, just at the base I was at. Every day, year we were there, right? I mean, that's just like an insane, that figure's always stuck with me. And to your point about Iraq, like, yeah, what do we have to show? Iran now runs that country, right? Iran runs that country. I mean, it's very frustrating. I think at a high level, right? If you're looking for silver linings, not at a personal level, but like at a strategic level, and how do I reconcile my personal experience with being part of this larger thing that kind of ended up with, we'll call them suboptimal outcomes. I guess my hope is really that, for better and worse, it created an entire group of pretty hardened people, right? Who learned pretty hard skills. Like, you look at what some of the people much more experienced, much more deployed, much more kind of high speed than me, people deploying 8-10 times, special forces guys, just regular unit guys. There's a kind of a brotherhood in there, or kind of a shared experience, shared sacrifice, shared challenge that, may have not been worth the cost. But if we're looking at, hey, the cost is sunk, that I think is probably a silver line. Is you've created a pretty interesting, just a pretty hardened group of people, I think. The other kind of high level silver lining, maybe, and this is a big maybe, is hopefully it's taught us some lessons, and we're a lot more hesitant to go do these nation building type exercises in the future. That's a big maybe now.
Like,
I mean, I kind of have this feeling like they're looking around right now for like, hey, where, how are we going to keep Raytheon stock high? Like, where are we going to go?
Yeah. I mean, maybe for some like yourself and others that hear a story like this. And, I think, like I opened up with, I think one of the hopes of Bitcoin is that it will inhibit the ability of whoever controls the monopoly on violence to use it so willy-nilly for whatever nefarious, malicious, self-serving gains other than defense.
Yep.
I think, and so to the extent that prior examples help inform why that is a good thing, then that's potentially a silver lining, though history is littered with such examples, and absent the means to inhibit it, it doesn't seem to do much good over the course of time. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about Bitcoin, because this is a point that's made a lot lately, or is becoming to be made more, and I think it's very salient in that in the fiat era, you don't even need to directly raise money from the citizenry to go and do these things. You can just press a button and surreptitiously steal from them and go off and do whatever you want, pretty much without any accountability. Because what are the people going to do anyways?
Yeah.
What do the protests do anyways? I mean, none of it has really any effect. It doesn't matter which party is in power, the same thing is happening. And so it seems like the only way that that's going to stop is stopping the ability to steal from other people, steal from the citizenry, so that you can fund such things. And then you're way more accountable to the people who are the monopoly on violence is way more accountable to the people, such that hopefully we can be more judicious with that monopoly on violence in the future.
Absolutely. I've heard that point made as well, and I wholeheartedly subscribe to it. Imagine if you had a vote and said, hey, American people, do you want to pay $1 million in taxes every day to feed these guys at this one chow hall in this one base in this one country?
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure the answer is no, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, conversely, I think, and I may be wrong, who knows, if you had polled the American people and said, do you want to pay your own taxes, we're not printing money, to go smash the Taliban and hunt bin Laden for a year in Afghanistan in 2001? I think the answer probably would have been yes, right? So to your point, it absolutely increases accountability. I mean, when you can just start printing money for all these things with absolutely no proof of work, right? It leads you to a state where you're almost like a military and empire searching for the next adventure versus reacting and making sound judicious decisions about what does defense actually mean, right? And there may be certain appropriate times for offense, but as part of a defensive kind of strategy versus, let's just go see if we can build schools in Afghanistan or something, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's
and not just the unrestrained capacity to do that because of the way you can siphon off wealth, but the necessity, as you alluded to right at the beginning, that this apparatus derives its influence and power from its exhibition of power, from its application of the power that it has. It has to continuously go and do that to keep everything held together. So it has to continue to go and exert its power, capture resources, be involved in all these geopolitical affairs, so that because the money has no work in it itself, right? Because there's no backing to it itself. So the power behind it is the backing. So it's incentivized. It's a necessity that it goes and it shows what it's capable of, let's say. And so for both of those reasons, I think it's imperative as quickly as possible that is stopped. And again, you mentioned the idealism around Bitcoin. I think that's part of it, right? Separating money and state such that a different set of incentives is what's driving behavior, both on the personal and the collective, let's say, level.
Absolutely. And it's kind of funny, like there's a psychological aspect too, in terms of like, if you're the big man, the big strong man, like you can't show weakness, right? And so you're incentivized to kind of continue to flex, right? And to increase that kind of chest thumping capacity or whatever. Like even, think about a guy like Putin, right? He's known as the big strong man. Like he's incentivized to continue to act that way and to show weakness. Like he's got guys all around him who want to take him down, right? Same idea with what you're talking about. If the system is based on you being the big dog and kind of projecting at least shows of power, then you're incentivized to do so, and you're very much disincentivized not to do so, right? And those are kind of two different things, but they're related. And I think, not to get too far into it, but I think that was what a lot of veterans were really I think the Afghanistan withdrawal like was an absolute disaster. And I think for the first time in a long time, maybe Iraq, but less so because we kind of chose to pull out or whatever. But that one really, the Afghanistan one really hit home with a lot of veterans and really left them disillusioned and angry.
Especially the way it happened. You're just like, what the fuck? After 20 years, this is what's going down.
I actually
leaving $85 billion worth of equipment and a tail between our legs and the chopper on the roof, like is always the case. I mean, that's where we're at.
It's there was a news thing with the Taliban doing their 1 year anniversary or whatever, and they're all in all of our vehicles, all of our planes, whatever. And I was joking with a friend, and I'm like, let me put it this way. As I mentioned, I'm just some guy who joined up, right? I was a logistics officer. And if you had asked me and one other guy to design and execute the withdrawal from Afghanistan back when we were 24-year-old lieutenants, we could have done an infinitely better job. Right. And I say that with all humility because like the bar is very low compared to how it actually went down.
Yeah.
It's just a mess. But kind of to your point, I think that whatever world we want, the current state of the world is kind of what we were discussing, which is, the US is the big dog maintaining kind of this imperfect global sort of system. And I think that was a turning point in that in terms of, a lot of other countries looking at that and being like, whoa, both friends and enemies, right? Enemies being like kind of licking their chops and friends being like, oh shit, this is like what we're, right? If the global order is maintained by this, like maybe we need to rethink the global order.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, that was very personally frustrating, but as a kind of strategic at a country level, like it was also has, I think is going to have some far reaching implications into the future that we probably may not even realize yet, or that may be playing out, right? As you kind of get this bifurcation of the world order and kind of this East, we'll call it like the China and BRICS and Russia alliance and sort of the US Western alliance. And I mean, we see that playing out right before our eyes, right? The whole oil thing, with the whole energy thing, the whole petrodollar thing, with Saudi Arabia coming out, with India being like, we need stuff. We're going to buy whatever from Russia. Like, I think these things are all sort of interrelated. But to your point, it's all underpinned by the current system, and a lot of it is driven by like financial and monetary considerations, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely all interconnected, and it's hard to think that we don't exist. Like this moment in time is not an inflection point of some kind. There's so many things converging and so much change happening that, because we tend to we have a very simplistic view of the past. We connect the dots that are basically laid out for us in a way that just makes sense to our worldview, kind of irrespective of even if the truth of history is even really able to be discerned. But, we kind of have a simplistic view. And we just, we think about the future and we just extend it out a bit. Maybe you're into technology and stuff and you say, okay, well, computers will get faster and AI is developing and all this kind of stuff. But the state of the world more or less, stays the same, because how are you to know how to project out and what changes might occur? But yeah, I mean, it seems like the world order is being shaken up. And on the one hand, you have all the players in the former world order that was dominated by the US, right? The Pax Americana, if we want to use that term. And now there's probably a lot of jockeying. Like you said, they're licking their chops or they're worried and they're like, okay, like, how is this all going to play out? And then you have, I think, the Bitcoin thing, which is people saying like, there is a big shakeup coming, but hopefully we cannot descend back into the same type of arranging the world order just purely based on power that we did in the past. And maybe we can arrange ourselves in an alternative way. Now that's a big if, because, the former is a very, it's a gargantuan thing to turn around and to, recapitulate. And then you of course have everyone's agendas, for the super green people to the WEF and all this kind of stuff. And so this is why I don't spend too much time trying to figure out like who or what is in control. And I think a lot of us inevitably have to throw up our hands and say, you can't know which agendas and who's behind what and what's playing out in the world. I think you have to return to certain fundamental principles. And I think this is why a lot of people in the Bitcoin space end up either being drawn in or becoming very principled people as a result of being in this space. Because you have to say, like, there's chaos in the world, and there's chaos in my mind, of course. Everyone, contends with that. And you have to say, well, what are the orienting principles that I'm going to kind of,
100%.
use as my masthead, that I'm going to stake myself to and say, look, I don't know what's going on in the world, but if I orient myself by these principles, I think that's the best way to generate the best possible outcome. And I think a lot of us are seeing in Bitcoin those same principles that maybe we even, determined before that they were the things that we wanted to commit ourselves to truth, to freedom, to peace, to fairness. And we're seeing them represented so pristinely and so pragmatically in something like Bitcoin that we say, yeah, this is right. I don't know, I don't know how this is all going to play out, but that's the greatest degree of clarity I can muster toward building something that's as good as possible. And so I'm going to align myself with that. I'm going to align myself with those people, and I'm going to do my best to contribute to it and be a part of that force rather than a part of the force of another set of principles. Because what else do you do? I mean, there's no
right.
How do you, I think you have to do that. There's too much chaos in the world
to invade the West, right?
What's that?
You can't go invade the World Economic Forum.
Yeah, exactly. And what do you just want another fight? And this is the other thing about, Bitcoin being so often referred to as, like a nonviolent or a bloodless revolution. And I've made this point before, but let's take the example of like a drone bombing of a wedding party in Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever, right? And under the auspice or the assumption that there's like a bad guy there amongst many good guys, or many not bad guys. And, an innocent person gets killed, and it happens to be your son. Will you ever be able to see those people as the good guys? Or are you the good guy and you're the victim, and the bad guys just did the most horrible thing imaginable to you? And so in that way of settling things, of managing things, of creating order in the world, that's why it perpetuates and always has perpetuated, because determining what is good and who is bad is a matter of perspective most of the time. There's not that many genuinely evil people out in the world, at least as far as I'm concerned. It's about people thinking they're good, doing things that end up being interpreted as bad to a lot of other people. And this is ever present in the world today. I mean, look at the super woke, far left, WEF, however you want to characterize them. I think a lot of them think that their policies around energy or their policies around, children and all these issues are good. They're virtuous. They're progressive. When in fact, the application of them seems to be generating, and I think logically would generate, a lot of hardship, a lot of suffering, right? So there's a huge disconnect between what you think you're engaging in, what you're doing, and what the outcome actually is. And I think the only way to mitigate that to the extent possible, because there's always going to be some of it, is aligning your action with principles and values as much as you can, and sticking to them. And there's still going to be there's no utopia, right? There's still going to be bad outcomes. I think this is why there's also a return, or at least a return to exploring and investigating traditional values, traditional philosophies, religious belief systems, etc., because those are somewhat time tested. There's a lot of wisdom and thinking have gone into them. They've been applied in many different places and times. And is there any insight or wisdom that we can extract to them and carry over to our time to help subdue some of the chaos that is seemingly running rampant in the world today? And I think, I certainly see that in the Bitcoin community as well, or Bitcoiners as well. And I think there's a lot of merit to that approach, to say, like, things have gotten overly complexified and as a result overly chaotic and perhaps overly fragile. How do we distill things back down to things that we can be more certain in, and how can we then hopefully use them to orient ourselves optimally? Something like that.
So it's really funny. I'm kind of laughing on the inside because in addition to the thing I wrote, I'm working on something else that is really just, it mentions Bitcoin, but it's a little bit more broad. And it's kind of tentatively titled Back to Basics, right? A prescription for what ails us. And it's just this whole concept of across the board, culturally, economically, financially, spiritually, food, health, schooling, you name it, again, nothing's a utopia, but we are going to be much better served by saying, okay, time out. Everything has gone batshit. Everything is way too complicated in an unnecessary way.
Mhm.
We need to go back to basics, right? And if you think about like sports, or frankly, like a military unit, or really anything, right? Like there's that one in what's the movie Miracle with Herb Brooks and the USA hockey team, and like he just has them do sprints all night till they throw up, right? It's back to basics, right? It's just a reset. And I think, but in the good way, not in the, the great reset way.
The great reset, yeah.
Right. And I think part of, obviously, Bitcoin plays a huge role in that. Back to basics, sound money. And it's a little of a misnomer with Bitcoin because we're going back to basic principles, but with a futuristic technology, right? Sound money, hard money. But it's not necessarily a return to what was. It's let's build the future with all of the cool new stuff, including Bitcoin, but on a foundation of principles that are basic and that are time tested, to your point, right? Like there are certain truths that I don't even know, ancient Chinese philosopher, medieval Dutch farmer, Upper West Side Manhattan lawyer today, right, that apply to all of them up until about 6 seconds ago historically, that everybody agreed on, right?
Yeah.
And we've definitely strayed from that. So, I'll keep you posted on how that goes. It's just really funny you said that because it fits in so well with what I'm writing. And also, obviously, Bitcoin represents this back to basics, right? Get back on a hard money standard. And kind of to your point before, what hopefully will be really interesting to see, and hopefully we see in our lifetime, is how does this new world order look if everybody has this universal monetary truth known as Bitcoin, right? What are the incentives? Because all these things take time to play out, right? And if everybody now operates on a sound money, what are the geopolitical implications of that? What are, the specific military implications of that? I know, Jason Lowery is doing all that work up at MIT, and I understand most of that, but not all of that, right? Pretty big brain stuff, but it's really fascinating to think through. But I think it all kind of ties together in terms of that being a really big one of the pillars of this sort of back to basics mentality of, you cannot have historically, anyone who's ever listened to a Bitcoin podcast knows like fiat doesn't last. It's almost a law of physics, right? Or math. Like it's never lasted. It never will last. So something has to come after that, right? And there may be governments around the world that think that's gold, right? Maybe, but I think if you look out far enough, it's almost a no-brainer that it's Bitcoin. It's just how do you get there, right? And that's the challenge.
Yeah, 100%. And I wonder too, how much of that are we going to experience? It's going to be a never-ending process, of course, right? It's not just like, hey, we've arrived and it's as we always thought it was going to be. And, sometimes I think, oh, this is going to take a long ass time to play out. But then you look at a phenomenon like the internet or the mobile revolution or that kind of stuff. And that's by virtue of the fact that we're so connected now and that the benefits of being connected to these technologies are so extreme that it's detrimental to be excluded from them or to exclude yourself from them, that perhaps there could be a lot of change very quickly. Now, of course, in the geopolitical or political context, I would say that's probably going to be very destabilizing, right? And this is what we, us Bitcoiners discuss all the time, like just how destabilizing and how to manage and adapt to that rapidly changing landscape. And I think, this explains much of the things that we're experiencing today, right? Whether it be, the COVID response, or whether it be what's happening politically, or whether it be what's happening with gender, what is happening with militarily, like this is all part of the destabilizing force that's seemingly coming to a type of crescendo now. And we shall see. But I agree with your point that there's going to be, there's a topic I've been thinking about and exploring a lot lately, is to what extent has progress and modernity overstepped its bounds, and so basically, how should we be considering progress? Like what about and in the modern world, we basically think of that as technology, right? Yeah. Technology equates to progress. And some people equate it to like certain government styles of social support and stuff like that, which I completely disagree with. But most of people think about it technologically. But how should we be thinking about that? And like, are we over-indexing for the value of technological sophistication or complexity? And as you said, I mean, it conjures up these images of like, well, what of the past have, time-tested traditions or ways of behavior, principles, have we too quickly done away with in favor of just development and advancement? And I don't think this is entirely conscious, but for the sake of this conversation, let's say, and which are we going to go back to and try to reintegrate into ourselves and into the culture and dial down some of the emphasis that we might place on material complexity, let's say. And, like there's many ways that you could kind of explore the logic here. But even as something like medicine, one of those things that we often talk about as being highly advanced is medicine. And they say like, well, people lived way shorter lives back in the day. I think most of that is explained through the birth rate being a lot lower, and that throws off the average age. But if you think about someone today who basically eats whole natural foods and is physically fit and spends a lot of time in nature and gets their sunlight and gets their fresh water and all that, and has good relationships in their life, how much healthcare do they really need? And the answer is very little, most often. There's obviously exceptions, but like if you live that type of lifestyle, you're probably going to live a long and healthy and vibrant life. And so if that was the default life, at least for people in a certain period, parts of the world, thousands of years ago, thinking of kind of like the Mediterranean or Fertile Crescent, then was medical advancement even something desired for them, or
right,
like, did they need it as much? Basically what I'm trying to say is like, we've placed ourselves in this position where we've interpreted the things we've developed as being progress, when perhaps in many cases we've generated the circumstance that requires them, right? So we've generated these lifestyles that the standard American diet, let's say, is absolutely horrible. People are incredibly sedentary. They don't move around. They don't use their body. They're not out in nature. They're fat. They're, all this kind of stuff. They're just horrible. And so medicine has had to develop in order to address that state that modernity has put people in. And I'm not abdicating their responsibility. People have put themselves in it in large part, but certainly the context of things, well, everyone doing that has generated a context that makes it kind of a positive feedback loop. But if that were not the case, presumably you'd have less incentive or less need to, to have so much development in the medical domain. Anyways, my point just being like, when we correct for those things and when we bring back some of those principles and values and into our lives, I'm curious, and with Bitcoin as a pristine mechanism of determining at least market value, and I think that has a lot of impact on how we determine value in our lives. And as a side note, I think this is why you see a lot of Bitcoiners ending up valuing things that are intangible. So not necessarily the mansion and the yachts and that kind of stuff, but friendships and health and meaning and meaningful work and self-actualization in other means. Like, how is that going to reorient how we act, and as a result, society? And then how are we going to interpret progress? And then how are we going to look back on this period and be like, instead of saying, wow, we were at the height of civilization over the course of, the last 5,000 years, maybe we'll look back on it and say, wow, what an aberration that was, that time, right, where there's so much of this distortion and so much violence and so much ill health and so much distorted or perverted thinking. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the whole is kind of broken. There's like a schism, right? It's funny, you almost want like the ancient Mediterranean lifestyle with modern day cancer care, right? That's how I would put it. There are certain parts of it, but what you don't want, like to your point, what if you took like, I don't know, some of Plato's students, right, and brought them today, and you said, go sit in this cube for 8 hours, don't move, do this, have this sedentary lifestyle, and when you feel bad about it, go drink a ton, and we have like this whole armada of drugs that you can take, right? Like to your point, I'm not sure they view that as progress. Now, if they had this weird thing like cancer or some odd, crazy thing and you took it and magically fixed it, it would seem like magic to them. So, to your point, I think and it's weird to think kind of how technology advances no matter what, but the human side of things can get really dark, right? And it goes up and down. And sort of as technology advances, the human side, I think, is a lot more volatile. But also, to your point, like, my dad always uses a phrase about a lot of things like technology in search of meaning. And I think we're sort of at that stage where we don't have meaning that we create technology around to better fulfill, some kind of ideal goal or some important end state. We have whatever, like dick pic apps and like TikTok. And, like, that is not something that needs to be created, right? And so, but we have the ability to do so. And it seems almost like, at least, the modern part of our civilization is almost like so civilizationally exhausted that we're just looking to like, what trinket can we make next? What digital kind of like little toy can we do? And again, to bring it back to the money, like, think about the whole, like how the funding for that works and where the money comes from. And, not to rip on VCs, but like which VC is funding that and what their interests are and where do they get their money, and that whole kind of cycle. Think about the incentives within that. Like, are you really incentivized with this kind of money to go out and do the hard work of creating something worth value versus, like, I don't know, I can get rich pretty quick if I just do like TikTok too and market, right? And so it's really interesting to think, but I do think, to your point, we're at this point where if we did it correctly, you could really take this like next step civilizationally in terms of you combine our modern day technological abilities with this concept of back to basics. And, you got a pretty kind of a superpower civilization there. It's a lot easier said than done. Right. But obviously the money has to be part of that. Right. And having an actual hard money that, like, to your point about the market-based stuff and like healthcare, for example, I defy anyone in the United States of America to tell me what it costs to fix a broken arm, right? Like, you don't know. There's 8 million different line items on the bill. There's 40 different people getting, like, my daughter broke her arm. The top line item was $22,000 to fix a broken arm. I paid $0. You show me a world where that system makes sense, right? And I think if it's market-based, imagine if you had to pay for your healthcare in cash, not through insurance, but in cash. I think you'd see a lot more people pursuing healthy lifestyles to avoid having to go to the doctor for all these things, to avoid having to take these medicines. Now imagine if you had to pay in Bitcoin, right? Like, to part with that.
I'm gonna take care of myself.
Right. You take care of yourself. Like, your incentives are perfectly aligned, right? If I got to go to the doctor and pay in Bitcoin, like, man, it better be for something like an emergency, like a broken leg or, something worse like cancer. Like, it's not going to be because, like, I kind of have a headache or I'm feeling like down today, right? So I think that's a big, again, it all ties together, right? But kind of from the health perspective and the technology perspective, if you can combine sort of a return to these basic principles with some of the technological advancement we have, it's almost like reorienting all of this brain power and energy and pretty incredible technology, just reorienting it in a better direction. I think you have a really, like, that's what gives me hope for the future. And no one's ever really accused me of being an optimist, but I think that's, that would be probably the way that I would frame the best outcome we could have, right, going forward. And to your point, like, I hope I'm around to see it, because these things take a lot of time. And like, I'm 41 now, and only recently have I started being like my biggest regret about Bitcoin and kind of all these other, I don't call them revelations, but sort of changes in my view on things is like, man, I just hope I'm around to see it. Like time's not stopping, right? And so it would be really cool to see this stuff play out. And even if it's just step changes, right? Like, you're not gonna go from, to your point, from here to there immediately. But if you can see these incremental changes, and I think we're maybe starting to, you have a really exciting future.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I catch myself saying that to myself a lot, right? Like, man, I really hope I'm around to see some of this renaissance, even just the beginning,
Yeah.
but then I have to remember we
Yeah.
are, this
Right.
conversation is that, we don't like to ascribe too much relevance or importance to our individual actions. And I don't think like this conversation has that much, but like it's a trickle before it's a flood, right? Like it has to start somewhere. And where it's starting is, the people that you and I both know and have spoken to and follow and learn from, and the things that we say and that we write that are all just contributing to this formation of this thing. And it's gaining more and more mass all the time. And this is how it's done, right? It doesn't happen like one day it's not, one day it is. It just every little bit as people get more drawn in, as you said, like when you start thinking about these things, you start being more critical of the philosophy that you live your life by, your political philosophy, your economic philosophy, what you deem most important or most valuable and meaningful in life. All these things just click, 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 click every day. They just kind of change and are tweaked a little bit and tweaked a little bit. And they inform how you behave and who you interact with. And that happens to 100 people and then 1,000 people and then 10,000 people and 100,000, million, 10 million. And at a certain point, you look around and you say, wow, I can't believe we've moved this far, on the journey. And I think that's even true since, a couple of years ago in Bitcoin. Like the types of conversations I'm having now versus when I first started the podcast, which was in late 2019, let's say, are pretty different.
Right.
Like we are shifting to a broader discussion about, all sorts of things. Like we're speaking here now about philosophy and health and living, and like it's starting to permeate through. And so, and I feel that, like that's my experience. Like I've gotten from and continue to get every day so much energy from being in some capacity, even not involved, even if I wasn't involved at all, just knowing that this exists and using it to amplify what's meaningful and important in my life. Like even just that. And of course, I think a lot of us are experiencing like a type of intellectual renaissance where you're just like, your brain's on fire and you can't consume information fast enough to integrate into your perspective and reorient, your pattern recognition and how you see the world. And every day it seems like, like there's a mind bending thing that you didn't consider before, and you investigate it. And that's it. Like this is how it goes. And if we're right, if what's causing that to happen within us, i.e. Bitcoin and all the related things is true, then I think, well, it's the truth of it seems to be represented in the impact that it's having on people. And if that's a valid metric to determine truth, then I think we're really onto something here, because the impact that this is having on people seems to be so positive that how could you say that it's not true, especially in like, because not a common criticism is like, yeah, well, you're all just drinking the Kool-Aid. And of course there's like a self-reinforcing aspect of all that when you put yourself in a type of echo chamber. But I think at least we all don't want to be deluded. Like I think a lot of us are more rigorous in trying to confirm our conviction than are many other people with strong convictions today. Like, call it, the slay your heroes, or call just poking holes in your thesis, or why there's so much hunger for these conversations and for reading this material and what have you. Because when you feel like you're in the presence of something so true and therefore something so powerful, you really want to make sure it's real, because belief is a motherfucker. Like once you believe something, behavior flows from that. It's not a matter of discipline. It generates the preferences that inform your action. And that's the double-edged sword of belief, perhaps, because if you hold a convicted belief and it's not true, then all those actions that effortlessly flow from it may lead you to a worse place. But if the belief, if the principles, the value of the thing that's causing that is true, then presumably it leads you toward the truth, which I think is a synonym for the good. And so, and I think a lot of us, or at least I'll speak for myself, don't want that to happen, or want to engage that process as consciously as possible, because I want to seek the truth. Like I want to no matter what it is, good or bad, difficult or easy, like I want that, because I guess I have a faith that the true and the good are synonymous. They're intertwined. And that's that's a statement of faith about reality, if we want to take it there. But, and so I realized how belief operates, I think, at least to a certain degree. And I don't want to be a victim of that. I want to make sure I'm engaging something of such influence as best as I can. And I think a lot of us are like that. And therefore I think we're doing a decent job at encountering something that is so strange and novel, and trying to figure out if it's real, and testing it on the only real ground that matters, and the only one that's righteous, which is in the playing field of our own life and our own minds and our own consciousness, and not out on others in the world in advance of ourselves.
I totally agree. There's a lot there. I think, if you kind of go back to that marketplace, right? Like truth wins out in the market eventually, right? Like Bitcoin is almost like the company that lasts 100 years versus quarterly earnings, right? If quarterly earnings are lies and manipulation, then truth is Bitcoin and that thing that lasts forever. And I think ultimately, like what you were saying, I kept thinking of building these parallels, right? Parallel economies, parallel societies, parallel aspects of society, and how Bitcoin plays into that, right? And it's a lot easier to, I think, build something based on, these basic principles and these fundamental values than trying to alter kind of a corrupt and sclerotic and kind of dying set of institutions that are really not, like, if you do that, you're going to be banging your head against a wall. And I think a lot of people feel that. And I think a lot of people that get into Bitcoin, where you see, like, they had this belief system, based on all these old institutions and everything. And when they come to Bitcoin, at least the kind of like self-reflecting ones are pretty aware of that. And they're like, okay, right? I mean, I'll just speak for myself, not super technical. I work at a big corporation. I understand business, blah, blah, blah. But like, I'm not the technical guy. And so when I started looking at Bitcoin, same thing. How do I, like this? Come on, this is silly. There's no way this is going to work. Okay, maybe it'll work. And you kind of start to poke holes in it. And like, I'm not exactly qualified to sit there and poke holes in the base code, but like as a sort of probably more from like the financial and monetary end, maybe the social cultural end. I'm constantly looking at it like, okay, what doesn't make sense here? And you put in those hours and you realize like, I respect this thing more because I've tried to poke holes in it, and because I've questioned it, and because I've frankly like sort of scoffed at it or whatever, versus something where I didn't really have to do that. And so I had a very strongly held belief about X, Y, or Z, but because I didn't poke a bunch of holes in it or try to, I don't really care about it as much. I don't respect it as much. And it's not as deeply held a conviction because it hasn't survived kind of that gauntlet, right? That truth testing. So it's a really interesting, I mean, I remember kind of when I first heard about it, and I dismissed it because the person who I saw posting about it online was someone who I kind of bothered me and annoyed me. It was like a guy I went to business school with. And I was like, oh, well, if he likes it, like that dude sucks.
It must be an idiot.
Yeah,
it must be stupid.
Meanwhile, he's probably got a net worth about 100 times mine now, right? But then, everyone gets it at the price they deserve. And I came in and it was recommended to me by a very smart hedge fund guy that just happened to be a friend I grew up with. And, I used him as a little bit of a proxy for kind of validating it, at least at the beginning, because like he's a very serious guy, very smart thinker, very rigorous thinker. And said, I put a lot of work into this and like, you should buy it. Oh, and he offered to buy it back at a certain price from all of us. If we didn't like it, much higher than the market price.
Chad move.
Everyone kind of, such a Chad move. And he actually doesn't work at a hedge fund anymore and does other very Chad things, which is cool.
Whatever the fuck he wants.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So he actually started a non-alcoholic brewing company called Athletic Brewing, and
cool.
They're killing it. But
dude, I'll tell you this anecdote because it's so relevant to what you just said. But my girlfriend and I, we go to jiu-jitsu multiple times a week, and I've always loved beer, right? And I try to I only like, I don't drink very much, but on the weekend I'll have like, one or two, but I've always loved it. And after a hard workout, when you're hot and sweaty, I mean, there's nothing more satisfying. Right. And so we have a bit of a habit now, like not all the time, but every now and then after our session, we'll go get some non-alcoholic beers and just crush them on the side of the road on our way back to our flat.
That's awesome. Look for Athletic Brewing. I swear he's not paying me for this. I have to ask for permission or something. But yeah, they're killing it. But he was a guy who taught me, and my brother, he's actually kind of closer friends with my younger brother. And these are a smart group of people. A lot of them work in finance, and they really did the homework and dug in. And then what's also cool is you get this kind of, and I'm sure you've experienced this probably on a larger level, but you get this group of friends that you were friends with anyway, or acquaintances with, or close with, or whatever. And there's probably a reason for that, right? Maybe it's just because you had some shared experiences, but also there's got to be some level of kind of shared worldview. And it's really neat to see it click for everyone kind of at the same time, or at least in a staggered way. And all of a sudden, like, you have this group of people, and I kind of view it as like these little fire teams or these little platoons, right? Even just like the Bitcoin meetups, but more so like a pre-existing ones that now are all kind of tied in together with this thing, right? And trading texts about it, and like, all the updates and sharing podcasts. And it's like, okay, we're all just holding hands, diving down this rabbit hole, right? Like, it's just a pretty cool thing to see. But, and it sort of validates what you're talking about before. And what I was mentioning is to see that many people give it such a rigorous test, kind of all separately on their own, and come to the same conclusion, even strengthens your conviction more, right? Because you're like, okay, I'm not the only one who kind of kicked the tires on this and like scoffed at it, or maybe dismissed it, or maybe was a little skeptical of this or that. They all did too, and they all still came to the same conclusion, which is mine, which is like, this is inevitable, right?
Yeah.
Time TBD.
Yeah.
So it's cool. It's a really, I love like sort of the social aspect of it as well, and how that kind of ties into people. Just, it's almost like the scales drop off their eyes, right? And they just see, you can't unsee it. You just cannot unsee it.
It's freaky. I mean, I totally agree. And how cool is it to have a thing that not only you can get together with your homies and like, get together at the meetup or the bar or whatever, and you're all just like sharing the new epiphany, or like, really passing back and forth these ideas. And it's in relation to something that's so consequential or so meaningful, because my experience was, prior to Bitcoin, like, I'd always been quote unquote thoughtful and wanting to know how the world works and all that kind of stuff. But how do you fix it? As we've been discussing, like, absent something like Bitcoin, how does this big mess get turned around? And definitely to a degree, I was despondent. And, and if you can avoid just going out and getting blasted and doing that kind of stuff, well, even if you don't do that, you're a little more mature perhaps, but you go around and you're having small talk with people, and you're just like, well, we're not talking about anything interesting here. This is I don't give a fuck about the political controversy of the week, or the celebrity this or that. Like, this is all just bullshit. And then something enters your life where not only is it so consequential in what it can do to the world, but it's so multifaceted that you can go down so many different rabbit holes, or you have to go down so many different rabbit holes to properly understand and contextualize it. So you got to go down the economics and the monetary and the, math and physics and the social and the historical and the, like, it's never ending, right? That's why we call it the Bitcoin rabbit hole. And it's so stimulating that, as you say, I mean, it really brings a richness to your social life now, to the extent that you have those interactions. I know there are a lot of Bitcoiners out there that are still kind of isolated, but it's great, right? Because you can actually, it's meaningful now. Like, you're getting to get, there's like, you feel like you're on a mission together almost. Like you're really trying to, there's a mystery here, and you're trying to figure it out. And you're, and to your point earlier about how, as you were speaking, I think a lot of people in the modern world, and this is a fairly judgmental assessment, but lead kind of the unexamined life, as it were, right? So much is just thoughtless. So much responsibility has been abdicated, and there's so much dependence on other systems, institutions, people, etc., that people just kind of check out, or they have a very narrow view of things. And I think that what Bitcoin represents, and bringing it into your life and integrating with it and using it, as we often say, Bitcoin is kind of the personal responsibility revolution. And so if you're going to continue kind of expanding that scope or sphere of responsibility that surrounds you, you need to examine those things that you're going to start encompassing, right? You need to be more knowledgeable about them so you can do that capably. And that's awesome. But also it's transformative, right? Because if you're going from the type of person that didn't think about those things before, and as a result wasn't changed by the insights to be derived from doing that level of examination, once you start doing it, of course, you're going to have to, as we said earlier, reorient and upgrade your perspective. And this technology or this phenomenon is so antithetical, or it's so novel in relation to the system that we all grew up within, that it's very likely that it's going to require a substantial upgrade. We're right in the middle of that right now. And sure, we're the ones that are being upgraded perhaps the most quickly because we're drawn into this so intensely. But I fully accept that a lot of the opinions and things that I'm talking about now will be very different, or at least somewhat different, or at least more broad in 3 and 5 and 10 years time, because we're kind of having to recapitulate our perspective in relation to an like a totally kind of a different world, a different set of incentives, a different set of principles, and an emerging world rather than the one we derived all of our signals from before, which is, let's say for lack of a better term, the fiat system. So I think for that reason, it's a very transformative process. And to your point earlier about Terence McKenna uses this term called the Archaic Revival, which is, I think, kind of what it's a nice way to describe what we're talking about, which is saying, let's take the best principles and traditions and wisdom from the past, and let's marry it with the material complexity or material innovation that stacks on top of itself as history moves forward. And, I think that's probably the process that we're engaging in, and it's going to cause very significant changes in how we think. And just back to our counterpart in, like, let's say, ancient Mediterranean. And you were saying, like, what would they think of modern culture? What would they think of modern medicine and all that kind of stuff? And they would think like, well, most of this is garbage, but, the cancer treatment would be, potentially helpful. And maybe you're right. But I mean, you could easily consider a scenario too, where that person has a different perspective on their own mortality and how it relates to the life they live. And they might say, look, I live a life, I accept the life I live, and I accept when my time is up, and I appreciate, and I live so fully that the difference between 60 and 80 years is relatively, not a huge matter, or the difference is not all that valuable to me. And so the things that might allow me to extend it to that degree are not terribly valuable to me either. Now, again, it's just an example. I'm not assuming that that's going to be the case, but I use it as an example to speculate on just how much our perspective on things may be changed as a result of such a fundamental change on how we interact with each other, and as a result, the institutions that get built up, and as a result, the values that are imbued and manifested in the culture, and as a result, how those then reflect back in us, and that ongoing feedback loop of culture and consciousness, and how that gets capitulated and changed over the course of time. And so, and again, like, I got a smile on my face saying this because it's so fascinating. Yeah. It's, you go from a life where it seemed kind of boring and meaningless, and I know it does for a lot of people in the world today, which is why we have a mental health crisis and a substance abuse problem, and all of the nihilistic, despairing problems that we have in modern culture, to now be confronting something that seems to be the exact opposite of that, to be at least a catalyst for the reemergence of the examined life and all the meaning that might be brought into it as a result of that, is unbelievably exciting.
I couldn't agree more. And I think what you said before, you always were a pretty thoughtful person, reflective, and then this sort of, I'll say, amplified it or took it, in a certain direction. And I'm kind of the same way, and I fully agree, right? I think we're at the bread and circuses stage where people say, hey, watch football, do this, click on the latest app. And what's really cool about Bitcoin, I think, is there's a bit of a caveat. Like, if you're at all reflective or kind of thoughtful, and if you're decently intelligent, have some sort of, well-read enough to have some sort of kind of basic background, it's actually cool coming into Bitcoin as like an outsider or a newbie, because, and I actually think this goes beyond Bitcoin, right? I would actually say this about certain jobs, like certain facets of life, provided you're like, a somewhat like intelligent, thoughtful person and capable person, it's almost better because you're looking at everything with fresh eyes, right? And so what's always funny to me is like, I hear Bitcoiners talking about this and that happened in 2017. And I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I mean, I do now, right? But at the beginning, I'm like, I have no idea who this guy is, right? And then I hear the story, and before I know which side did which or this, that, and the other, I'm like, no, that guy sucks, or no, he was right, right? Or whatever the issue is. But it's really cool because, to your point, like, you bring this fresh set of eyes in, but with sort of some of your principles from outside of Bitcoin, and then the two interact, right? And I bring some of what I learned from Bitcoin based on those principles and based on my personality and my worldview and how I've kind of interpreted that. And then I bring that back out to the rest of my life and to kind of the other more normal parts, I'll call it. And it just kind of keeps going. And it kind of, it's almost like jumping in and out of the pool. And each time it's a little different, right? Each one informs the other, and then that reinforms the other aspect or other facet of it. And it's just really cool. And I feel like this is it's almost a proxy for personal growth, right? To a certain extent, because it just pushes you. And it's so weird to say that about like some electrons that are encrypted, right? Like that's just a weird thing to say, right? But it does, because it's much more than that, as we all know. And it represents so many other things. Like, I find like Bitcoin mining fascinating. I'm 100% farthest from the expert that you can imagine. But once the basic concept of like how energy companies could, or how Bitcoin miners could mine with flare gas, or how energy companies could get involved in that with stranded gas, how they can, balance the power grid, all this stuff, just at a high level, totally non-technical, totally fresh eyes. Like that to me was revolutionary.
Blows your fucking mind.
Revelatory, right? I'm like, oh my God, how do more people not get this, right? And that's just one little aspect. And so you get into all this stuff, and then you get into like, more than anyone, the trucker thing in Canada and freezing of assets and Ukrainians here and people around the world. And you hear the stories from like Africa and from the women in Afghanistan who had their money shut off, and all of these kind of things that are so much more broad than just kind of your circle of what's going on. And that blows your mind. You're like, oh my God, like what does this woman in Afghanistan who's fleeing from the Taliban or trying to pay the people that worked for her, basically off of a thumb drive or some words in her head, what in the world does that have to do with Chevron? Well, it turns out actually they're connected by Bitcoin, and they're both like totally unique but connected in fascinating aspects of the same thing, right? And that to me is why it's so cool, is because it touches everything in totally different ways. And then you kind of learn lessons within there, and then you bring them back out, to the real world. And I couldn't agree more. It also makes you contemplate the big things. And if you're inclined to do that, again, that's almost self-reinforcing. Like if you're inclined to that anyway, it just makes you more inclined. And it maybe, I would argue, makes you better at it, right? And it opens up new doors and new ways of thinking about things that you've kind of always thought about. And I do agree. Like, I think we almost have a crisis of like consciousness. Everyone's medicated, a lot of uninterested people, a lot of people want to be told what to do. It drives me nuts. Like I was saying, I don't care who like I like sports. I like watching sports. I played sports my whole life. I don't care who the backup, left guard is on the Baltimore Ravens. Like, I just don't care when I know what's going on in the world, right? And it doesn't mean that there's not time for like certain aspects of bread and circuses. It just means like, if that's all you're thinking about, or that's kind of the extent to which you're doing stuff, you're missing out. And I think, maybe it's always been that way, and it's just more amplified now that we're all connected and you can see it. But I do think there's some kind of loss there in terms of just like people reflecting on things, people taking a minute to just think through something, people being interested in things outside of the screen that's immediately in front of them, right? I struggle with this with my kids all the time. Like, I don't want them to be addicted to screens, right? But it's a hard battle. And again, like, we're in the middle of it. And so it's like, how do you get out of that? I don't know. If I could answer that, I would probably be in charge of something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the answer is slowly, methodically, consistently,
Yeah.
but over the course of time, right? Not all at once. I mean, if you have that out of the cave moment, right, where, as you mentioned, the gloss comes off of your eyes and you're like, oh shit, fuck, awesome, like all these different emotions, like you can't make all those changes in one go, right? So you prioritize, you engage, you keep going, and it's a never-ending process to, I guess, ultimately build and live the most meaningful life possible based on what you think is most valuable. And I mean, that's not easy, and especially it's not easy when we're coming out of the type of culture and world that we currently have. But now there's such a powerful catalyst and ally in that pursuit in Bitcoin and in the culture that it's fostering, that as much as you want to be blackpilled today when you scroll through Twitter or you listen to the most recent presidential address or any of this nonsense, you got to remember, like, there is so much good, unprecedented stuff happening. And the only logical thing to do is to leverage it to maximum effect in your life and to whatever causes are most meaningful to you. And I don't see what other option there is. But there's two things you mentioned that I wanted to touch on. One was, and we were discussing this a few minutes ago, but when there's that type of emptiness, for lack of a better term, I mean, it gets filled up with so many things. And, maybe it gets filled up with the things that are easiest to grasp onto, or that are most impulsive, or most speak to, hedonistic elements within us, or whatever. And I think it's hard to deny that at least that's what's partially responsible for that, is a lack of a greater source of meaning. Right. And I like looking at ancient societies, and this is entirely speculation, but there are some, like ancient Egypt, ancient Minoa, Indus Valley, that kind of stuff, that they seem to develop a level of cultural sophistication, both artistically and architecturally and religiously in their belief systems and stuff, and then stay there for like hundreds, if not thousands of years. And I wonder if not, like, well, as we were saying earlier, the reason why we have the manifestation of the culture in the world we see today is a direct result of the things that we value and the things that we want. And so if we're saying that there's this underlying meaninglessness, or at least that's not as developed as it could be, it's going to mean that our demands and the things that manifest as a result of our demands are kind of reflective of that. And so if there's no great sustaining meaning that we can access on our own, I think it's fairly reasonable or logical to think we're going to look out into the world for it. And we're going to want ever more stuff in the world to try to satisfy that thing. Whereas if we get to a place where that meaning is more inborn and it's more sustaining as a result of that, and it's more fulfilling, then I can see a diminution in the necessity for more stuff and more material wonderment out in the world, because we're deriving more of it inside. And so that was kind of what I mean by when I say I'm really interested to see, like, what the world looks like when this culture that we're participating in, let's say, is more and more represented, and therefore its values are more and more manifest in the world as a result of the demands associated with those values being signaled into the market, let's say. And so it's really cool, because as we've been saying, I mean, I think we're going to bring back a lot of traditional stuff and then sprinkle in a little modern magic, and it could be a really interesting scenario. And the other point you mentioned was, I think the kind of relation of Bitcoin to like self-help, right? And the joke's often been made before that like the orange pill is the only supplement you need to take, or it's the best self-help book around, or something like that. And I think, when you peel it all back, I think that's the power of the truth, right? What's more supportive of a healthy mindset and a healthy life than truth in its many forms?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's what you need more than anything.
Yeah, and actually, so to sort of circle it back to the veteran aspect of this, like, you have an extremely mission-oriented group of people, right? And when you and a lot of them get out and are looking for a mission, and like kind of the genesis of all this stuff I was writing and thinking about is like, what possible mission, like there are a lot of missions and there are a lot of worthy missions and a lot of unworthy missions, but like what possible like mission mindset could you orient them towards better than Bitcoin, right? Like it actually at a high level achieves some of this ideological or kind of idealism, I'll say, that they were hoping to achieve in the military and maybe did. And then at this tactical level, there's so many different aspects of it that are, overlap with the military. And then there's so many different aspects and rabbit holes that you can go down, like we talked about. Basically an infinite number of ways to be involved and stay involved. And like, to me, it's such an obvious thing to say, look, you're maybe a little bit lost. Maybe you're a little bit drifting. Maybe you're looking for some purpose, right? And this applies well beyond the veteran community, but just to kind of focus on them. Because I know to a certain extent, I still feel this way. I've been out a long time and definitely felt this way a lot when I went out. And so you're looking at like, well, what can I do? Where can I put all this energy where it actually matters, right? And so a lot of kind of what we're talking about is if you can reorient them towards that mission, you have a small group of people, relatively speaking, worldwide, but you have a lot of leverage in terms of people who kind of get it, right? Who just get the worldview and understand like the hard realities of things, understand why, exit strategies and, proof of work concept and like why having hard money is important. And all of the ways that things could go wrong and, are pretty hard-headed and realistic in that sense. So I do think it really fills like a mission void for a lot of people, both in the military who have gotten out and also just people who are kind of inclined that way anyway, to kind of have like a task focused or a mission focused view. It really lets them fulfill that aspect of things much more so, because I've always laughed at the corporate world, during recruiting and things like that. They're always talking about like why, your military experience is so relevant to this, right? Like investment banking recruiting is always a big one. And like they're both hard and you work a lot. And it's like, dude, I don't think sitting there doing pitch decks at 2 a.m., aside from having perseverance, like there's almost no other relation, right? Like
right.
Hardcore military stuff. And so it always kind of amused me, right? And it was almost like people trying to fit a square peg in a round hole in terms of like how your experience in this one arena was, applicable to the corporate world. And it's like, nah, dude, you're going to sit in front of a computer and type things just like everyone else. And so if you accept that as the current reality for a lot of these guys, myself included, like where you got to do something to have a job and make money and, earn a living and feed your family. Well, where do you get, if you're not doing something that like is your ultimate calling or, this mission that you think goes beyond yourself, and it's more of just like, hey, I'm doing a job, I'm trying to do it well. Where do you get that? How do you fill that sort of like mission-oriented void, that void of like wanting to serve something bigger than yourself? And that's where I think a lot of this side learning, like there's a lot of overlap between those two communities where if you can just kind of ignite that spark in that particular group and people beyond that group, I think they're very inclined to dig in and really like grab a hold of that mission and see it as their new mission and just kind of get involved and stay involved.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly makes logical sense. Has that been your experience thus far? Because I know I think you've written one piece about this, basically like speaking to the veteran community, or at least exploring that, what you just articulated. So has there been like, have you done much outreach? Are you in touch with a bunch of veterans? Because I think for those reasons and probably many others, and just the chaos of the, as you said, this applies to anybody, not just veterans, but perhaps, the chaos of the world is a little bit more, salient to them, or they have more kind of up close and personal experience with it, that a solution, a supposed solution like this would appeal to them. Has that been your experience? Like, is there any sort of resources for veterans and that kind of stuff?
So part of me wishes I had a better answer for you. And the reason I don't is I'm pretty early stages and kind of thinking through all this, right? So my initial thought was, I think it was like last fall, it was before the Bitcoin conference, because I did go to that for the first time, which was awesome. But I was at this, kind of 2-day shooting course thing taught by a former very tier 1 operator kind of guy. And it involved like sort of little classroom type things about preparedness. And he's talking about, like kind of prepper type stuff. And he was making jokes or whatever. And he's like, I have little vodka bottles to hand out, stuff to barter, like shampoo and obviously food and all these other things. And he's like, cash. And immediately in my head, I'm like, dude, wait till I tell you about Bitcoin. Right? And like the mindset is there, right? It's like, if I could just introduce you to this Bitcoin thing, like you don't need to understand all of the technical aspects. Like you're smart guys, just get the basics. So I think that's kind of what planted the seed. And then something as simple as just going to the Bitcoin conference for a few days. And I saw a couple people posting, like actually Marines specifically posting like, great seeing other Marines at this conference. And I'm like, man, like something's got to be done here. So I just wanted to basically get my thoughts on paper and kind of have something to orient people around in terms of this. I think, well, I have a couple ideas, right? Just random ones, if you'll indulge me. I do think like at that conference or either other conferences, maybe, there are half-hour panels. Could be a very interesting panel discussion, right? Bitcoin and veteran. Just get some either kind of well-known, kind of higher profile veterans or some veterans within the Bitcoin community or whatever that may be, and kind of have a discussion there. That could be interesting. My kind of other, it's sort of a two-pronged approach, right? I want to introduce this concept into the Bitcoin community, but I also want to introduce the Bitcoin concept into the veteran community. So what I wrote was more oriented towards the Bitcoin community, but I think, it would be really cool, maybe through kind of second, third order connections, to try and get in touch with maybe some of the more well-known guys that have a little bit of a following out there. And just talk to them about this, even privately, just introduce this concept and be like, if this makes, and I don't even know, maybe some of them already, it's clicked for them, right? But if this makes sense to you guys, like, let's talk about it or use your platform to kind of disseminate this. So I don't really have anything like formally organized yet, like in terms of a actual outreach group or anything like that. I'm kind of frankly just thinking through what best direction to take this in. And so anyone listening to this, I'm welcome to ideas.
My sense is that there's probably a decent number of, well, I mean, there's a lot of people that that hold Bitcoin, even smaller group that are maximalists, and even smaller group that, represent themselves or fuck around on Twitter. But even amongst that small group, I think there's probably quite a few. I mean, I can think of some. And these days there's so many podcasts out there. I just default assume that there's a Bitcoin and veterans podcast out there somewhere. I mean, you mentioned going to the Bitcoin conference. There was a bunch of like peripheral smaller conferences during that week. I think the one that comes to mind is I can't remember what it was called. It might have been like God and Bitcoin or something like that, where a bunch of Christian Bitcoiners got together and had such discussions. But yeah, I mean, it makes sense from the point of view of coming together, sharing ideas to try to put forward, the most impactful language or framing possible to that community, because who would know better, how better to speak to them than you and other people that have had similar experiences. But it'd also be cool just, for you guys to get together, because I'm sure like other ideas would pop out of it, like our background, our expertise, our skill sets, and Bitcoin, and then like what aspect of the culture might we contribute to, whether it's information or whether it's products, services, who knows. But as you said before, like there's possibility and potential and space for everyone and every background in Bitcoin, right? If it genuinely is emerging if it's going to become like a dominant culture, well then, the surface area of that is pretty much endless, right? It appeals to people from all sorts of backgrounds. So yeah, I mean, you should get together and try to find the others and at least, kick off some conversations and see what everyone's thinking.
Yeah, I plan to. That's kind of phase 2. There's a group called VITA, Veterans and Digital Assets, that's pretty interesting, but they're definitely not Bitcoin focused. I mean, it's kind of everything. So I'm more focused on Bitcoin, not really anything else. But
it's such a different philosophy, I feel. Like,
it's almost, nothing wrong with the group. Like, you do what you want to do, I'll do my thing.
Sure.
I would prefer it to be kind of Bitcoin only, just because that's my focus. I couldn't, even if I wanted to talk to you about all the other stuff, I'm not interested, so I couldn't really talk about it.
But this impact we've been discussing, this reorganizing effect, it's just different, like when you meet other people that are effectively maximalists, like there's an immediate connection, like, oh, I see where you're coming from. Like there's an alignment on values and principles, and you kind of can almost immediately know what their perspective is. And I mean, it's magic. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I love going to the conference, because you're able to meet so many people, and within seconds, like, you're homies. Right. And with other ones, that gloss that you mentioned on the eyes, and again, I'm being a bit of a dick here, but it's like still there. It's not removed. And it makes the connection different, so I do think there's obviously a difference between being kind of like thinking it's a multi-coin world and focusing on, Bitcoin and the elements and attributes inherent in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, like I kind of mentioned, the social kind of socio-cultural aspect of it too. I mean, again, veterans and Bitcoiners are two huge varied communities, but generally speaking, like, you get in touch with some of the right kind of veteran groups, and like, again, there's a lot of stuff you don't necessarily have to explain to them. Like, you'll have to explain a lot of the Bitcoin part maybe, but sort of like why Bitcoin, all of the things leading up to what would make that a choice. Like, they see it, they get it, right? Even stuff like just the health stuff we talked about. Like, these are generally guys who are eating clean, into physical fitness and taking care of themselves. A lot of personal responsibility, right? I think I mentioned in my thing, Jocko, you probably have heard of him, big personality, awesome dude. Not that I know him or have met him, but really all the stuff he puts out is great. And this whole idea of like, extreme ownership. Like, if you were coming up with a tagline for self-custody Bitcoin, it would basically be that, right? Like,
yeah,
the whole thing about like, I was also kind of thinking about his line about discipline equals freedom. And I think
I love that one.
Yeah, like, he could probably explain it better than I can, and maybe even you could, but this idea of like, you have the luxury of doing, in the military context, I'll put it, like, you have the luxury of doing all these high speed, cool things because you've got the basics down, because you're disciplined, right? Because you're physically fit enough to do it, because you've done the basics, and you don't even think about it, and you build on that concrete foundation of discipline. And that itself, you're not a slave to like, well, I don't know if I can do this because I'm not in shape, or I don't know if I can do this because whatever, right? It's, you build on this concrete foundation of discipline, and then it allows you so much more freedom. And I was like, it's really, I think, a decent parallel to Bitcoin, in the sense that because you're building on this immutable code, right? This concrete foundation, that is the discipline that allows you freedom to then do layer 2 solutions, layer 3 solutions, things we haven't even thought about yet. But, integrating Bitcoin into like health services or food or whatever your thing is, that freedom comes from the discipline of the code and of how it was constructed, right? So I think there's a really cool parallel there, where it's like, if you can kind of frame it in those terms, I think a lot of people on both sides would understand the parallel.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think that's excellent framing. And I've always loved that. I think I don't know if Jocko coined it, or he probably just, really popularized it, but I always thought of it in terms of, if you, in a disciplined manner, go, basically approach your life, accounting for and making sure that the essential stuff is taken care of in all domains, right? And you engage that process in a disciplined manner, like it's non-negotiable, then all of those, knowing that all of those things are as well in place as they can be, then, as you say, it frees your mind up when you want to explore the fringes, when you want to try to push the bounds of your understanding or push the bounds of your capacity. Then you have that foundation of, you've put yourself in the best position possible to give yourself the freedom, so that you're not worried, you're not thinking about, you're not consumed with the concerns of all those other things. So you're allowed that freedom to discover something new, to explore something new. And I think that's right. It's a matter of, determining which limitations are most validly to, subordinate yourself to in a certain sense, and make sure you're doing so properly such that you can, explore novel domains, absent being, confused or distracted or drawn out by those concerns that you could have gained a certain amount of control over through discipline. And so doing that allows you that exploratory capacity, and not doing it kind of inhibits it. I know this is a kind of a large question to end on, but I can't help myself when I'm speaking with military people. The monopoly on violence is something I think about a lot, because we've gotten to a place in the world technologically where, we have nuclear arsenals all over the world. And as we go into the Bitcoin era, I think it's pretty reasonable to assume that there's going to be a kind of splintering of jurisdictions, because people are going to be so much more mobile with their lives and with their wealth that you'll be able to make those decisions, and you won't be so restrained by the things that were keeping people in place, as it were, before. And so I think this puts pressure on, large bureaucratic nation states and people, and jurisdictions are going to have to become more efficient and more competitive, and basically the sovereign individual thesis playing out. But we have this issue that, one, presumably the monopoly on violence will shrink dramatically, but there will still be a mechanism to mediate disputes, whether, even if it's only in the realm of, let's say, land, if it's not in the realm of other wealthy things, but presumably it'll still exist in some capacity. And of course, nuclear weapons will still exist. Now, I heard someone say recently that all those nukes will just be decommissioned for like small nuclear reactors to mine Bitcoin, and this is how we're going to basically decimate the nuclear arsenal and remove that risk from our concerns, which is a very hopeful one, if not an entirely realistic one. But what do you think about those two issues?
I mean, that would be cool. I wouldn't put too high a probability on it. Based solely on and you kind of get into this thing, right? Like, I know there's a lot of issues with the nation state and whatever, but it is what it is, and it's probably, at least in the current form, going to stay. And the difficulty, I think, sometimes with the nation state stuff is, this is maybe, if I'm being completely frank, this might be the one part of Bitcoin that I still have a little bit of, not skepticism of, but I think is maybe a little bit naive in terms of people talking about, dismantle the nation state and this, that, and the other. And it's maybe, but what's your timeline, right? Because, it would be cool to see that happen to a certain extent. It might also introduce a whole bunch of things, even with Bitcoin, that we can't even foresee, right? So I don't know exactly. The other problem is, when you're dealing with nation states, it's states plural. So if you go even to something like nuclear disarmament and that whole thing, and when during the Cold War, we can do whatever we want, but how do you make sure that Russia does it, right? Or even all these green protocols and stuff, and us self-flagellating our societies for having plastic straws, and it's cool, but what about India and China? Right? Cool. You guys now use paper straws, doesn't do anything. Right. And so I guess that's a sort of a glib way of trying to illustrate this idea that it's a multi-nation state world. And so it gets very, very challenging. I do think, from a monopoly of violence standpoint, again, it a little bit ties back into the discussion we're having about back to basics. You look at the Constitution, right? Well-regulated militia. You look at how we won the Revolutionary War. It was basically, and I'm not saying, militia and the weird connotation that we have now. I'm just talking about stuff like the National Guard even, right? There's a certain amount of autonomy that governors have over that versus, the Pentagon and at the federal level. And so even then you get down to stuff like self-defense, and, there's a certain aspect of violence there, and you don't want vigilante Wild West justice, but at the same time, let's say you live in a community that's fairly rural, tough to get police there. You're all somewhat like-minded in terms of self-defense, and you're close with your neighbors or whatever. I would argue that that's almost sort of like a decentralization of violence, or the capacity for violence if needed, right? And you then also get into this idea of like, I would say at that level, the decision of whether or not to use violence and how much is probably a much more accurate one than at any sort of centralized, distant kind of decision-making authority, right? And so just that principle of like, the more localized, the closer you are to the thing that you're discussing, and probably the better perspective you have on it. So I don't know if that really answers your question. It's a tough one, but I do think, like, to summarize, nation states, plural, act not necessarily in concert with one another, and will almost certainly always go with what's in their interest. So it makes it challenging. I do think Bitcoin can help, alleviate some of that. I'm not sure it can completely eliminate it, at least not in any short time frame. And then just, that monopoly of violence, like, I do think it's important to, have that basically as disseminated and decentralized as possible within the confines of the law and everything that we have to deal with, right?
Yeah. I agree with much of that. And of course, I'm definitely guilty of looking at the future through perhaps overly rose-colored glasses or orange-colored glasses as a result of Bitcoin. But you have to account for how dramatically things can change, and I agree with your point on the kind of decentralizing force in society, which is why I think, gun rights and stuff like that are so important. And then when people are responsible and capable of defending themselves and their communities and their families, and they're aligned on values, then should threats emerge, they probably will join forces to meet those threats, which is, again, as you referenced in the Constitution and the idea of militias. But I think the point about nation states and, kind of how much longer, or at least in what form will they continue to exist? I just don't, I think funding themselves is going to be the big issue, because they're so bloated now. And now that there's, to say nothing of, like, the debt that they've racked up, and of course they'll inflate it away, and what kind of chaos that will create. But the punchline being, the jurisdictions, well, first of all, everyone has the capacity to custody their own wealth now. And so over the course of time, I think circular economies will develop. And so when you're being paid in Bitcoin, and when you're transacting in Bitcoin, and nobody can, no one's the wiser about those transactions, nobody's taking their pound of flesh, well, that funding becomes even harder to maintain. And then you have competing jurisdictions, albeit small ones at the beginning, which are experiencing so much more prosperity as a result of more free and open competition in markets, and less regulations and less oppressive taxation regimes and all that kind of stuff, that I think the decreasing amount of ability to fund themselves, compounded with the competitive pressures by jurisdictions that have taken a different route or have adopted to the new monetary landscape that is Bitcoin sooner, will put quite a bit of pressure on these jurisdictions one way or the other. And, there'll be a lot of laggards that fail to see what's going on, and they'll be the ones, most likely, unfortunately, that continue to be, more of their flesh gets extracted from them. But I don't know. You're probably right. But
it's
who
a good
knows?
point.
History's weird. Things can happen fast.
Well, it's like that old, I forget which prime minister or whatever, but it's like one of the British prime ministers was asking, his predecessor, like, what was the hardest part about the job? And he said, events, my dear boy, events. Right? It's like, you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But to your point, I mean, it's a very good point. Like, you might even see something like, I mean, we didn't even touch on the debt, and that's a different conversation, but it's obviously massive, just a horrendous debt situation across the world, public and private, right? Levered 3 or 4 times basically to global GDP. But you look at, like, the EU, the debt, like, if you're a betting man, there's a pretty decent chance in the next 5 to 10 years the EU splinters, whether they like it or not. And the sole, or the probably the primary driver of that, aside from, like, this energy crisis, which is just exposing things, would be the debt, right? And issues around the debt. And so maybe it's a staged kind of thing where it happens in stages, in terms of, the trend has been towards centralization, right? The EU is like a perfect example of that. And the realities of physics and math dictate that most likely, or at least a decent chance, you're going to have a more decentralized EU going forward as a result of that debt. And maybe that kind of theme plays out across the globe. I don't know, but I think it's certainly possible.
Yeah. And I mean, whether it's through not being able to, see transactions and take a cut, or whether it's because people move to these more free jurisdictions, the punchline is your tax base is diminishing. There's going to be I don't know, perhaps we've even met that horizon already in real terms, but in any case, it seems to be a pretty safe bet that the tax base is going to shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink over time. And what do bloated governments do about that? And well, I think the only answer is they adapt, they shrink their operations until a finer, more equitable, more balance is achieved between the two constituencies, or they collapse. And the former would, I guess, be better, especially if they do it on a timely basis. But knowing how stubborn and ingrained so many things are and these systems are, the latter is, if you, as you say, if you're a betting man, you probably bet on that one.
Right. It actually, when you say that, it kind of reminds me of an article I read about Detroit years ago. And I think if I recall it correctly, they had shrunk the size of the city physically because they couldn't pay for it. Right. And there was in such shambles and collapse, they actually shrunk.
They just redrew the lines, you mean?
Yeah. We can't turn on the street lights out here or whatever it was. And they just shrank it. Right.
But, you are no longer part of the city.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You're on your own. And I mean, the other is a total aside, but I remember the other crazy part about that story was people were lighting fires when something bad happened, like a murder, a robbery, or assault, whatever, because at least someone would show up because the cops were so stretched thin. It was in such a bad state, And so
that's the point, right? You tend to think things progress linearly, right? But as you say, events happen or exponentials, take effect. And what you thought was going to take 100 years, the breaking point that you thought was going to be met or how it was going to be met is different. And it ends up only being 10 years. And then there's a massive uprising, and then there's this chaos, and then there's a reconsolidation, and people have to figure things out. So, I think we all would want to see as little chaos as possible. But as we said when we started this discussion, I mean, we seem to be in a time of great change, and who knows how that's going to play out and how quickly it's going to play out. But again, thank fucking God that we have something in Bitcoin where we have a peaceful opt-out, or at least, because most people aren't opting out entirely, a way to insulate yourself from the chaos, and a way to contribute to something productive that could be a not only a viable, but a much better replacement for what's been, what we've experienced up till now. And that, again, what more could you want? That is the best possible option available, because the pitchforks and the coups and all this kind of stuff, even if it works for a time, it ultimately fails because you're victim to the same type of system, and you're victim to the same incentives, and you're victim to the same human, fallibilities in these positions of power and stuff like that. And so, we got to do our best to be good Bitcoin citizens, I guess is the punchline.
I think in the piece I called it something like a monetary medevac, right? And this
yeah, I like that. That was
good.
This
wounded kind of society sitting there, and I don't know, maybe it doesn't take everyone, maybe it can fit a lot of people, maybe it's not taking you to the best place yet, and it's a 2-stage journey, but it's getting you out of the shitstorm, right?
Yeah.
It's getting you off the battlefield, and you're hurt. So I don't know, we'll see. It's it certainly gives me hope. And as I mentioned before, I'm not exactly always the most optimistic person.
Yeah. Well, I think I can appreciate that. And hope is a powerful thing to have, so that in itself is enough to be thankful for. Wes, any, final comments or anything you wanted to get off your chest before we shut it down?
No, just one, really enjoyed this. Thank you very much for inviting me on to talk about it. I really appreciate it. Two, I guess if anybody has good ideas about how to further integrate kind of these two communities, whether it's veterans listening to this or Bitcoiners or people who happen to be both, I would love to hear from you. Basically just kind of trying to figure out, how do we have the most impact? What can I do going forward? And I'm really sort of in the idea germination stages. So welcome any input. Yeah, Bitcoin is hope.
Well, I agree. I really enjoyed this. I appreciate your time. And if there's anything I can do to facilitate that endeavor, just let me know, and I'll do whatever I can to help.
Awesome. I really appreciate that.
All right, brother. Take care of yourself.
All right. Thanks, John.